Good evening. Welcome to SCI-Arc. That kind of sound comes from someone who has the option to leave, which means that they're either in their last year of school here or they're a visitor. But welcome anyways. It's the second lecture in the series. I think there might still be, as there were last week after the lecture, a list of all of the lectures that are going on. I think it's quite an exceptional lecture series, once again put on by the students. All of the lectures here are put on by the students, the graduate students in the fall and the undergraduate students in the spring. The students responsible for this semester's lecture series are, and these aren't ranked in order of importance for those that know the names, Phil Rutherford, Jeremy Levine, Amy Sims, Benita Welch, Zach Karadian, Bill Eveloff, and Tom Holtman. Okay, on to tonight's lecture. I'm going to skip all of the biographical stuff. I mean, you know he was born, he was educated, and he's now practicing architecture. His office is in New York. His work seems to be all over the world now, as it seems to be for many people practicing these days. Most architects tend not to be trusted in their own city for whatever reason. But the couple of notes is this year he received an important prize, which I think is a result of the sort of dedication he's had to the discipline in the pursuit of his ideas. The Arnold Brunner Prize from the American Academy and the Institute of Arts and Letters. And his work is going to be exhibited in the series produced at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and it'll travel. His work will also be exhibited this year at the GA Gallery in Tokyo. Who is he? Stephen Holl, of course. That's why you're all here. It's amazing, with no advertising, what can happen. Stephen has always made things in order to first test his ideas. It's taken many forms: pamphlets, theoretical works, objects, and buildings. But he has, I believe, always had a clear interest in conveying his ideas and his method of exploring them to others. Like some other architects, historically, teaching became a forum for his ideas. In retrospect, this seems inevitable. His curiosity, his willingness to want others to know and feel the wonder of his world, and his great skill in doing so is the natural form of an important architect-educator. He's part of a growing number of architects of this generation that pursues architecture as a research activity. It is a critical practice, one that continually explores the material, the tectonic, and the programmatic reality of a project in relationship to its theoretical aspirations. Certain aspects of his intellectual curiosity has led him to the use of geometrical systems of order, diagrammatically and descriptively, but this extreme has always been coupled with the sensuousness of the material world, thinking and making, seeing and touching at both the macro and the micro scales. He works at all scales: small objects, the tables they go on, the rooms and the buildings they go in, and finally their place within the city, each one at each scale informing the other. And regardless of the size of a project, each one suggesting strategies of an urban scale. When you look from a distance, either directly or indirectly, you can see what all things have in common. Sometimes they even may look the same, but when you bring the lens down and focus it close and stare without blinking, you begin to see what is peculiar to everything. If you look at Stephen's work in both ways, you'll begin to see the intensity of it and perhaps you'll begin to appreciate the great skill it takes to make these works. Stephen Holl.
I apologize that I have a case of double jet lag today because I just flew from Norway and then with only 8 hours in New York from New York, and it reminds me of a story that Kenneth Frampton tells about meeting some people in Heathrow Airport in London. They were Bedouins sitting in a great circle on the floor on a carpet with their eyes closed and their hands on their knees, and Frampton asked what the situation was, someone standing by, and the story is that the Bedouins flew from Egypt in 8 hours, but they believe it takes 24 hours for their souls to arrive, and they're waiting for their souls to arrive. And I feel, in a way, connected to that problem. And just something about Norway. This time, in fact, thanks to Tom Main, I saw the black wooden churches, the stave churches, the incredible churches, vernacular churches of 1,000 years ago built. And we saw them in a really strange circumstance, a really bright sunny day, driving in the landscape and seeing these white painted wooden buildings, which are the natural houses, and all of a sudden arriving to a mound and seeing this black church, absolutely kind of painted in tar, and going inside, and there's almost no light, and just the smell of the inside, the interior, and the kind of impression was amazingly powerful. And I have a little quote I'd like to read, which reminds me of this sort of contrast of those white buildings on the landscape and these black churches. I call the high and light aspect of my being spirit, and the dark and heavy aspect soul. Soul is at home in the deep shaded valleys, heavy torpid flowers saturated with black. The rivers flow like warm syrup. They empty into the huge oceans of soul. Spirit is a land of high white peaks and glittering jewel-like lakes and flowers. Life is sparse and sounds travel great distances. That's the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. But it's interesting, to me, when I was reading this, it was just a coincidence, and I could just see those buildings, those two types of buildings in contrast. Can we have the first slide, please? Tonight, what I want to do is not show you my work, but it'll be in there. It'll be kind of chopped up in a thesis, which I'm calling Pretheoretical Ground. And I think maybe this is a thesis that I'm making because I published a little book called Anchoring, where I made an argument about a priori condition for architecture, that every building should have a concept and that every project should be based on a relation to its site. And in that book, whenever you do anything, you print something, then all the things that you leave out haunt you. So I made this lecture a year ago, and I keep changing it. But basically, what it is for me, it's the pre-theoretical ground. It's the sort of things in architecture which, in a way, every project deals with, regardless of site, regardless of an a priori. And I guess maybe the key figure for me in this is Merleau-Ponty, and I just want to read a couple of things. And again, it's an inquiry and it's a probe. It's not a principle or an ideology. This connection to phenomenology as a discipline. If I walk along the shore towards a ship which has run aground and the funnel or masts merge into the forest bordering on the sand dune, there will be a moment when these details suddenly become part of the ship and indissolubly fuse with it. As I approach, I did not perceive resemblances or proximities, which finally came together to form a continuous picture of the upper part of the ship. I merely felt that the look of the object was on the point of altering, that something was imminent in this tension, as a storm is imminent in storm clouds. And Merleau-Ponty also says, our point of view of the world and the body are intertwined. And I think this is especially important for architects, and especially important in architecture, that this experience that we make, that we somehow organize on the face of the earth, really is intertwined with the human body. And actually, in that sense, a kind of, let's say, precondition or pre-theoretical ground is the point of view. Whether it's 5 feet 6 off the ground or whether the body is in another place in space, as it so often is in the 20th century and will be in the 21st century. So one has to think once again of this condition of the point of view in the world intertwined in a new relationship. You might criticize this as a kind of condition only speaking about sight. And I remember a quote by Borges where he said that he could see with his hands. Another condition I would call depth, which is also part of this pre-theoretical ground. There is a depth which is not just the geometrical distance between things in space, a depth which is not just a positioning of elements as in a perspective drawing. There is a depth which is not merely a new perspective on space as first seen from an airplane. But again, when I think of this thought, I also believe that when the general public could fly, as we so often do, and we get a new perspective on our cities and on our landscape, that it would somehow change our basic psyche, change our relationship to space, and therefore change our architecture. In the course of events, technology can't be ignored, although I would rather not make it a focus of this argument. But history is changed by technology. What you're looking at now is the 40th Symphony of Mozart, written 200 years ago, and what you're looking at is a glitch in a CD. The plastic is peeled up, and you can see the dips in the aluminum that the laser light will bounce off, playing that piece of the 40th Symphony. So you can, in a way, see that there's a rereading. And in this sonar scan X-ray, through 60 feet of ice, you see a ship that's sunk, looking for the Northwest Passage in north of Canada, which we only know about because of 5 years ago they took this sonar scan. So, in other words, somehow history is really altered from our point of view in this position that we're in today. So there are a number of categories that I want to bracket off the work and speak about these dimensions. The first one, an obvious one, in terms of phenomenology, is matter and material, and how in our architecture, I mean, we experience it in the world. There's a sort of hailstone that fell in Texas in 1973. We experience this condition in nature, but we make it in architecture. Just a few slides of a little tiny project we made, really speaking about density of matter in the front of the building and lightness on the interior. Cast glass, for instance, which was used to hold planes of glass in the facade together. Or acid-stained brass, which the main facade was built of, and then details like door handles appearing to be almost warped and pulled out of that density that we were trying to achieve. And then on the interior, reversing that, trying to achieve a kind of lightness. But I put these two slides up as a kind of caution and as a polemic, that matter and material cannot be experienced in photography. In fact, photography is an enemy of architecture. The wide-angle lens, the different color filters that the various photographers use, and the way we experience architecture in the magazines is actually, I think, one of the biggest problems. These two slides, I go back again, are of the same space, two different photographers, two different kinds of lenses. To me, they look like two different spaces. It doesn't look like the same space. So you see the problem of this dimension of matter and tactility. It can actually be erased by color photography. I don't have enough work which is strong enough to make this argument, so I use some other architects now to sort of make the point. And this one always impressed me. This is Sigurd Lorentz, the church at Klippan, all in brick. Everything is in brick, the walls, the floor, and there's an amazing detail of these steel beams that run transversely through the space, holding up this brick vaulting work. very simple. In a way, column, beam, and armature all in one, and this sort of condition of light coming in to this space. The brick floor, the brick ceiling, the brick walls. You really sense this sort of potential and density of brick as a material in Sigurd Lorentz, and even down to the details where the window is a slab of glass clipped on to the exterior brick wall, and you have no mullion at all, and there's a kind of connection to the interior and the exterior. Another place of that intensity is in the Johnson Wax Building by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'll just show the main point, which I feel in a way the building revolves around, and that is the amazing Pyrex glass tube work, which brings light into the building. But that's not something that's easily achieved. And I also put this up because I believe that architecture today has to be drawn thoroughly all the way through in the details. And here is, in the hand of Frank Lloyd Wright, the detailed drawing of the first attempt at bringing that light in at the cornice of the wall in the Johnson Wax Building. And you see a totally unworkable glass block in a chevron shape. And here in this drawing, which is also in his hand, he's not passing it down to the detailing of someone in the back room getting it out of graphic standards. You can see the tubes first emerging, and also this is bound up in trying to get someone to do something. In this case, Libby Owens, I think the Pittsburgh Glass was involved, and they refused to do it for a certain price. And the person that finally did it, the company that finally did it, Frank Lloyd Wright had to drive there. It was a 10-hour drive from his office, and plead with them and convince them to do the project. Of course, they told him that if they put it together that way, it would leak, and it did leak. And so 30 years later, it was replaced with neoprene gaskets. You can see there's an airspace also, and these are aluminum armatures, neoprene gaskets, continuous tubes, and the joint is actually one of a twisted wire that holds the tubes onto the frame. Another character with this, I think, sense of materiality, and he always left it evident in the work, a kind of revealing, is Pierre Charot. Here is his smith working on one of the details of the Maison de Verre, and you see at the Maison de Verre those hammer marks purposely left, even though it's a kind of ultra-modern design of a door handle. One can sense the materiality of the hammer marks left in the impression. Or deterioration is another way of revealing. I mean, one speaks about a materiality, about a kind of matter, and someone can come and paint everything and conceal it, but then somehow over time it's exposed once again. So this sense of materiality never really is concealed forever. In one project, we tried to reach this sort of level in a curtain wall. This is the American Library in Berlin, where the concept of a browsing circuit was inscribed in the curtain wall, and that circuit-like line work was to be achieved in atomized metal, which is something we discovered is a process of spraying metal on and atomizing it. It's a cold process, and it's done electronically. We made these full-size panels on the upper part here, and in the curtain wall itself, we were using a double-glazed steel mullion surface with sandblasted glass. In another project, using sandblasted glass, and one gets a secondary reading when the sun shines through the material, casting the sunlight onto the wall, and creating, once again, another sense of that materiality. So one could argue that material has a psychological dimension. In fact, that psychological dimension is not necessarily defied by that most powerful of media, cinema. Here in a Louis Brunel film, while she's biting the cold stone toe of that statue, you can almost hear her teeth crunch on it. Second category is program. And in this category, I would like to say that the programs often isn't enough, and that one has to invent a limited concept to orchestrate that program, to make the actual the sort of condition of program become alive. And just two tiny projects where we attempted to do that. A house in Cleveland, the first day off the plane, riding with the client, he says he has friends in the steel business. I'm already thinking about making this in steel. Just something I put up for my students. Never trust your first sketch. It could just be really a waste and totally, this idea that the architect can somehow just make the first sketch become the project, I don't believe that. Or maybe it's just my insecurities, but I know I've thrown away my first sketch 1,000 times. This is probably the 10th sketch. Basically, the concept or the program of the house, it was for a painter, and she had a husband who was a lawyer who was supporting her, and she wanted a New York loft in Cleveland, which really is just a big box in the forest outside of Cleveland. And so there was a novel I was reading which was written by C. Brockton Brown and was based in the forest surrounding Cleveland and around Ohio, and it was called Skywalk, and it was about a double, a man who dreamed of being chased in the forest and found out that he was chasing himself. So the notion of a double which is really one, a non-dialectic double, the idea of shearing the box and after that trying to join it in every possible way. So the shear line is on the contour, and after the basic shear is made, everything internally is an attempt to reconnect, to make a non-dialectic double. So in A, you have the basic shear. In B, a series of steel walkways which connect the north and south facade. In C, diagonal views of 110 feet. Do I have a pointer here? Don't have a pointer. Well, in the bottom left corner, you can see just a kind of moment about pragmatics. You can see a garage which holds 3 cars. You know, I love John Haydock's houses, and I love John, but somehow when you're faced with a real client and they tell you they want a 3-car garage, and you have to walk from the garage to the kitchen on the inside of the house, it's a difficult thing. And I was very proud about this house because it swallowed the 3-car garage without even, too much trouble. You can see it down below, and the stairway goes directly up to the kitchen. And also circumstance. The client, even though we have this idea of a sort of simple concept which orchestrates the house, the client comes later on in the process and wants to add a swimming pool. So I just added the swimming pool. And actually it's kind of interesting, this idea of a dish of water, and you could swim to the edge of it and hang your elbow over the edge. And, the entrance bridge obscuring the mouth of that triple garage. Series of perspectives which were done as doubles with the idea of this non-dialectic double. Which I'm still trying to find out exactly what I'm meaning by my thought of the non-dialectic double. So as a contrast, even though I don't mean these buildings to be related, but I thought as a kind of clarity, of thought, I wanted to show this project, which never got built, which was intended to be a dialectic double, intended to be 2 parts. And it's a house with an absolute minimum budget. It was in Oxnard. You can see the Pacific Ocean on a very tiny site. It was a weekend house for a doctor and his 2 kids and their wife and the wife. You can see the condition of the site was 8-foot setbacks, side yard setbacks of 5 feet. The houses in the area were all sort of shed roofs and funny things, and with these little side yards. We wanted to make space and really turn this thing into something about light and space because of the real fact that the building had no budget, and we thought we could build this in concrete block and really make it about the way light comes into a room. And so these early sketches about light and the passage of light deep within the house, but still groping, in a way, starting with the perspectival view of space and trying to think about light and not really yet having the concept that organized the whole house. And as it gradually came together, it became clear that one part of the house was the nighttime functions, one part was the daytime functions, and the house really began to have this interlocking quality. And so the notion of the light passing through that interlock and really making that become the lyrical heart of the building. So the building really in concrete block with some stain, again, a double garage, all the sort of average givens. The height limit, we built it right up to the top of the height limit because we needed to get that volume. And the nighttime side and the daytime side. And the plan, you can see at the bottom, in the middle of the plan, a kind of tower, which is a sort of box of shadows that you enter the building. No roof on that portion. Simple concrete block. And to emphasize the contrast between the two, on the nighttime side, we have yellow and its complementary color painted in the slot of space that divides the building on the daytime side, which is a blue. So that's sort of continuation of that dialectic of opposites, a complementary color. Just some sketches walking through some of the spaces, heading towards the entranceway, that box of shadows, which is that empty volume, which is the stair coming up to the house. Third category, which to me is very interesting from not only the interior, the sense of an interior, but the sense of urban space. And it's something we've been working with for a while. And I've come to feel that this word parallax embodies more than any other word what I'm trying to get across in this idea of this topic, pre-theoretical ground or phenomenological ground. And in the sense that from the standpoint of the human being walking through space, you have a change of perspective. You have a change of feeling about light. You have a change if you turn your head one way or another way. This condition, which I'm calling parallax, really is speaking about architecture from the standpoint of the human body and from the standpoint of experiencing it. And with that in mind, I think that the idea of the modern city is in a state of flux. And the notion of exactly how we experience it or how it will be experienced in the future is an open question. And the point of view is not 5'6" off the sidewalk. In fact, I'd go so far as to kind of really challenge Colin Rowe and Leon Creer with that top drawing being one of the 18th and 19th century, the horizontal XY space, the second figure down, the Z dimension being one which was beginning in the 19th century and now definitely is in the 20th century, and perhaps even the notion of a shifting ground plane in the city as a possibility, as a given, so that one really speaking about a new kind of urban space. We made a project in Milan, and I only show a few shots of it, where we projected spatial fields and then cast those backwards into plan fragments and knitted that together to form an urban sector. This is in the Porta Vittoria district of Milan. And in that project, we also made some other little devices in a way to help us think. Not to say that they're a polemic, but to help us think about architecture. And on the top, at 0, you have the basic 4 types of architecture. Architecture that's under the ground, in the ground, on the ground, and over the ground. In the next category down, you have the adjective beside, and you can run the full gamut, or all the way down, and number 5, within. It's just it was a way of thinking in that particular project for us to develop different spatial relations, different sectional relations, and different urban relations in a new sector of a city. And again, this is not something new. Rodchenko knew it. Many of his photographs actually tell that story without words, that idea of the point of view of perception. And in a way, it's not something that's bound up in technology either. It's something that one could say it holds at the very most vernacular and base level in the experience of a place. A project we did last year, and again I just show a couple of slides, which was based on the idea of parallax actually being a kind of urban space in the city where there are a series of ultra-thin towers, very tall. That height is 400 meters. And they create a kind of space in the city, in a new city sector, which would be positioning in a different way, or let's say calling into a different category the way the one moves across and between buildings, and the way that a figure of space might be inscribed in a vertical plane. This is something we're still working on now on another site. I won't tell you where the site of the original one was because I realized it was a disaster. It was in the wrong place. In fact, I hated that project because it was in the wrong place. Another kind of space, and I'm going to go through a series of kinds of space now to sort of bring this idea of space, parallax, and perspective. Shared space, and something that I think is very old. This is an ancient Japanese house, and you can see the positioning of the Soji screens vertically actually somehow shearing the feeling of an otherwise boxy room. Take that up into the light of the structure of the building, and even the way the beams and the supporting structure are lit continue the feeling of that shearing space. And it's a kind of space we used in a project in Berlin. Again, this is the American Library extension in Berlin. You can see the existing building down below. The idea of the original building was the open stacks, the open reading room. Our concept was to extend that, to try to extend that in its farthest dimension and make a browsing circuit which went up, around, and over the building. But the real challenge of that concept wasn't the obvious devices of a bridge, but somehow to make a regular rectangular space to charge that with the passage. And we did that with what I would call a shearing section. You can see CAT scans, like sections moving up through the building, and how the diagonal space, the main volume of the building, really is something that is sheared vertically upwards and drawing you upwards through the section. You can see down there at the base of that last rubber ramp a bust of Franz Kafka. It was a premonition I had about the future of the project for me, I think. Another kind of spatial thought was the encircling, the idea of creating a space which was a public space above, a kind of terrace, but was something that you actually didn't necessarily need to inhabit, but the notion of encircling, of creating a place looking back again to other parts of the building from other parts of the building. The children's library over the main block of the building, looking back to that block, but that sense of encircling or inscribing an otherwise empty space. Dissolving space. It could be a condition when we make a wall in a floor plan, but if we're thinking in terms of material, maybe that membrane that divides one area from another is something that's very delicate. In fact, a kind of condition of dissolve could occur or could be intentional. We did a project in Manhattan. The site is right below the notch at the top of that on the 49th floor. It's an apartment, and the only concept we really had was not to fight the shrill angle and the geometry of the building, but to actually try to float the space, to try to make it really lift into the mist over Manhattan. And we did this by tilting the walls 4 degrees, pouring a terrazzo, continuous terrazzo floor, which had white rocks mixed in a kind of cloud formation. And you can see how the walls tend to dissolve into the floor. So if this idea of a dissolved space, a dissolving space, is really going to hold, then it ought to work both ways, and I think it does. Could we have the next carousel? It was an interesting project because it was for a sheetrock contractor who made millions in Manhattan, sheetrocking skyscrapers. And I told him, I said, fine, Hal, I said, I'd love to do the project, but I don't use sheetrock. I want to use plaster. So he thought for a while and said, okay, if you don't publish my name, you can use plaster. He likes the project so much he's gotten into the plastering business. This is just a couple of details. An Icaran wing made in airplane silk, trying for materials that tend to dissolve the sense of space, or a cast glass fixture where the light has a way of dissolving across. It's not a kind of lens, but the nature of that cast glass tends to dissolve the light unevenly across the surface. Another kind of space I will call aqueous space. Project we're doing in Dallas, Texas, and the site has a series of dams and ponds, and the sense of this water rolling over the dams gave the sort of beginning of a program. And you can see in the center of the slide the existing stream and a series of 3 dams, and the house itself, which is basically a house for an art collector. It had no other program other than 6,000 square feet for the display of art. And we decided to, instead of make the house an object, to make it a series of spaces, a field of spaces, and to make a kind of equivalence in what I call spatial dams in the morphology of the building. And you can see these concrete block regular spatial dams which really divide the site into a series of 4 measures, in between which a kind of curvilinear lightweight structure hovers and creates on the interior a series of what I call aqueous spaces. So intentionally the plan is absolutely orthogonal, and these spatial dams are in a double wall concrete block, lightweight steel columns and lightweight steel framing in between. In section you have the curvilinear activating everything spatially, and as you move through the series of concrete block pavilions, we'll do, I think I have 3 views, starting from the left, which is the entranceway, moving from the living room to the living room into the library and the dining room. Just looking at that sense of aqueous space, the idea of actually pulling space down the wall from the skylight, almost in a fluid way, and the way one could actually really move through the house. All the metalwork is coated in plaster to kind of get a continuity of the space as it moves through. And between the last 2 spatial dams, a roof which tends to open up out into the landscape, and that last spatial dam, the pond on the site returns in and floods it. So it's really just a flooded room. And this is a great client because when she loved the project in the beginning, and when the mechanical engineer said he wanted to put the pool mechanical in the flooded room, she said, absolutely not. That is just to be an empty flooded room. So it was I was shocked how well she understood the project. In fact, I don't know, I feel like I became lucky because when we had interviewed for contractors, there were 4 contractors, each one being a little bit progressively more expensive. And the most expensive one was the contractor who had built the Lou Kahn's Dallas Fort Worth Museum, and the client chose them. So I'm hoping this project to be really well built. It's under construction now. It should be finished in June. A different kind of, let's say, argument for a different kind of space, and just a kind of preview of where this is. It's in Fukuoka at the bottom of that map, which is 2 hours south of Tokyo, and it has approximately the same climate as Los Angeles. It's on landfill. It's an international housing exhibition, which was put together by Izasaki and was inspired by IBA in Berlin, but IBA didn't inspire me, so I kind of made this my anti-IBA statement. And still, one can't help but, say something about the location. I mean, working on that site, there was a kind of feeling about Japanese culture and the tradition, even though it's not evident. It's certainly not in Tokyo, but somehow when you get outside of Tokyo, there are the dimensions of Japan, I think, that enter in and somehow give you a sense of connection to a culture. So in this anti-Iba mood, I wanted the building to be absolutely banal on the exterior, almost dull, and to make the building internally activated. And really, we talked about two kinds of space. Hinged space, which is about the interiors of the individual apartments, and void space, which is about bringing a kind of space internal to the block of an apartment building. There are 28 apartments, and they're all organized around a series of 8 voids. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner a diagonal line of the sun moving through. The upper void is a series of ponds, water ponds, and the lower voids are a series of gravel courts. And there are shops along the street level, but all apartments have at least 3 exposures. All apartments have an exterior front door. I was trying to kind of restate, once again, all the things about architecture, modern architecture in terms of housing that I think were achieved as positive things that the Iba, in a way, just kind of ignored with their double-loaded corridors and going back again, regressing back again to just a standard building type. The idea that all apartments have 3 exposures, the void courts are also activated in the idea that these are low-cost apartments. They're very small, some of them, but the sense of that void space is in a way part of the apartment because it's water and it's not owned by anyone, so it's a public space. In the back, those lower voids in the rear are not programmed. They can be places for children to play, places for tables. Basically, they're gravel courts. And part of the reason the building gets to be this section also is that in Japan, it's required that there are 4 hours of sunlight in every apartment per day. This would never work in New York. So that the building section actually worked to erode these in terms of these huge voids in the rear. Just a series of sketches walking on the first promenade. The building has 3 promenades, all exterior. Walking by the first one, you pass a series of water gardens which are reflecting light, and the direct sunlight hitting that water early in the morning, I'm hoping will reflect on the ceilings, so when you're laying in bed and you just look up at the ceiling, you see this sunlight kind of dancing on the ceiling, which is being reflected off those main water ponds. Up on the uppermost access, again, all apartments have an exterior front door. The concrete structure is exposed. There are 8 columns total in the building, otherwise it's all bearing in concrete. And as you walk from east to west, you see a lightweight structure of aluminum. As you walk from west to east, you see a heavyweight structure of concrete. There are 28 different apartments, each one completely different from the other, although they all fit like a Chinese puzzle into this regular form. So again, it's an architect's nightmare to work out all these different apartments. And then the central concept of the interiors was to provide, they asked for a brief of 3 and 4 and 2-bedroom apartments, and I said, well, I want to give you, instead of that, hinged space, which is a series of rotating walls, and you can make bedrooms or subtract them. If a child grows up to 19 and moves away, you can rotate the wall and actually subtract the bedroom. Or if a grandmother moves home to live, you can rotate 2 walls and create a bedroom. It connects to the tradition of the soji screen and the Fusuma walls in Japan, but it's also something that we had been exploring in Manhattan apartments with very tight spaces and using pivot hardware and lightweight hollow core technology. We found that you could rotate entire walls this way. Here's just a series showing the layout of, and you can see the location in the building of one apartment. The first position at the top of the slide is with all the hinge panels closed. Second position with the first room opened up. The next position, another room opened up. Here, even clearer, you see the top position is a double-loaded corridor, bedrooms on either side. The second position down, those first set of hinge panels opened up. the third position down, all the hinge panels opened up in the sense of the space flowing right through the apartment. And again, a different kind of condition where there's an enfilade of passing through a room. That hinge panel is opened, and one can see out that corner window in the front of the building. Building is under construction, going incredibly fast. It'll be finished in 11 months, which this building, for me, it's shocking because in America it would take 2.5 years at least. At least that was my experience in Seaside, Florida. 2.5 years in construction compared to 11 months. That slide you saw was 4 weeks before this slide. You can see it's up to the 3rd floor now. And they've kind of gotten ahead of us. They've told us we have 7 shops in the base of our building. We have 7 shops, and I asked if I could design some of them. They said no, because they're going to be such low-cost shops that you would never, there really won't be any design budget. And I noticed that there are 3 barber shops. And I said, well, what kind of barber shops are these? And they said, well, 2 of them are normal barber shops. So I was thinking maybe the 3rd barber shop is, well, I had some fantasies. Another condition of the transformation of space is the condition of light. And I think of the work of James Turrell and how consistently and dramatically he's demonstrated in his artwork that light is such a powerful transformer of space. One can think of all the labor that an architect goes to diddle with the wall materials and do gadgets here and there, but just a simple slice in the corner and allowing light coming in, how that completely transforms a spatial condition. Or even combining light with materiality in this project at the AA by a student transforming a rather dull window in London with waxed plexiglass or waxed fiberglass. Or a project, briefly, which we did, which had a basis in a skeletal frame, but the real interest was about how the light projected these linear elements in different ways along the walls of the building, and in a kind of constant change, in a constant dance. The sun is a projector in this house. Or looking out my office window when I should be drawing, I'm just taking this picture to show you what another category, what I would call the spatiality of night. That's the same space. And I think especially in our century, we have to think about this condition, the spatiality of night, because in a funny way, especially in the city, a new spatial condition is formed. And it's not the same figure, it's not that same model. It's something entirely different. In a project we did in 1977, actually this is the first project I did in New York, for a gymnasium bridge to allow people to escape the South Bronx. This idea of the spatiality of night is really central. You can see the gymnasium bridge structure in a kind of cowl wall material glowing at night, becoming a beacon. But what this argument really is about, in a way, could be understood also if you look in the lower right-hand corner. There's someone coming with a flashlight trying to find the entrance to the building. And that idea of a pool of light at the end of a flashlight is a kind of space that's created. In a way, this idea of a spatiality of night is really demonstrated in a microcosm, in a pool of light, as you hold it at the end of a flashlight. We also thought about that aspect in Berlin. At 6 o'clock in the evening, you're leaving work, you want to come to the library glows, it invites you, the sort of reading rooms, the sense of that night. Another condition, spatial reversal in reflection. And I think it's something, it's very difficult to think about when you're working on the drawing boards or if you're just working in cardboard models. But when you put in a piece of plate glass and there's a certain condition, a space can actually be reversed by the organization of that. Or even just walking to work, looking at puddles, how the space is reversed, how the perspective is reversed. Rome is a better city to do this in. There's a lot more mud puddles in Rome. time. In terms of trying to establish a phenomenological position in architecture, time is probably the most difficult of the categories, but it definitely is a powerful one. And we recently tried to deal with it directly in a project for the competition of the Palazzo del Cinema in Venice. One of the things I thought about, and this is a cinema palace with 6 cinemas, is how cinema really is a way of warping time. You can take 30 years and compress them into a minute in cinema. You can take an athletic event of a minute or a few seconds and extend it. So this idea of compression and extension of time gave us a kind of thought of organizing the building really around time. The site in Venice, you see the city of Venice. You come to the site by boat, and I don't have a pointer, but you can look at the diagram on the lower left-hand side, showing entrance by lagoon to the building, the existing condition. The Lido in Venice is a very thin morphology, almost suburban. An existing building next to it, which is a big casino, and the frame of the building itself. And we decided to hollow out the whole site and make this entrance by lagoon become really one of the major conditions. So the cinemas themselves, almost like accordions, are in a way clamped, slightly compressed, and overlap in this building section. And that's the first condition of compressed time. The second condition, which I would call absolute time, you see in the lower right-hand corner, which is part of the lobby, which is a kind of cubic pantheon. This is a masonry structure, which is for receptions. Again, it's the Palazzo del Cinema, so they're at the film festival period in September. There are huge receptions. But in this space, there's just a slot in the ceiling, and you can get an absolute measure, just like you do in the pantheon, of the passage of the time of day, as that slot of light moves across the space. And so the third kind of time is below, in a grotto space, which is completely flooded, and there are slots or gaps or fissures between the cinema structures where the light passes down and shines on the water and reflects back up underneath. And you can see here in section, the dark shaded area is the lagoon water itself, the boats coming in, and so the lobby on the left has double entrance on the street side, entrance on the lagoon side, and the cinemas are suspended up above. We also thought this is a way of giving a great public space to the Lido community, because the program really is something that only occurs, although they say they want to program it year-round, we feel that in a way, in that community, it might not be programmed year-round. So the notion of this big public grotto, which may have shops, would have a marina below, which would activate. And then this compression extension also gave us a way of activating the cinema spaces, kind of crumpled cinema spaces. You can see here a view of the building coming from Venice, and that's the lagoon. You enter in between the edges. And we also thought of the building as a kind of mute box, except for where the cinema is shining, and the screen could be removed. The cinema screens could be rolled up. And there, the light of the cinema would burn holes in the facade. So this is where you get wherever one of the cinema's screens are projecting, you can imagine them being rolled up, and these sort of burned holes in the facade where the power of cinema is kind of burning architecture. Otherwise, it's just a concrete structure, and we thought of leaving the formwork on the exterior of the building. The sort of rusted metal formwork would give us a surface texture, and then you can see the way into the grotto below. The last category I would call project and society. And it's the most difficult category, but I think it's very important if one's establishing a kind of phenomenological thesis, a kind of pre-theoretical ground. And that is to say that no matter what we build in the landscape, somehow whether we're building it for ourselves, we think from the outside in. We think about the landscape and, let's say, its new imposition. But usually we think from the inside out. We think about how it somehow facilitates us. But in the end, there are only a certain amount of resources, and the kind of, let's say, consumption and condition of resources is something I think even as architects we have, and planners, we have continuously to think about, to hold in front of ourselves, as the phenomena of this condition will certainly, most certainly, be something we all have to face in the future. So, as a project, I decided, let's really do it. This is the site. Let's do something with a larger format. We decided that the site was America. 200 years ago, it was a land to conquer. To cut down the trees was to really to sort of prove that we could make things. But now it's reversed. One white dot equals 1,000 people. What our thesis was is how to preserve, how to bracket out certain aspects of the natural landscape and allow the city to continue into the 21st century. We did 3 sites, and I'll just show you briefly 2 in conclusion. One in Cleveland, and we proposed something. Cleveland is spreading in all directions in shopping malls, like a lot of American cities, and we proposed something called a stitch plan. It's an X, and you can see 5 of these drawn on the periphery. And in that X, the idea is that you could cross from absolute urbanity to the rural. So in the black zone, you have what I call clarified rural. You would actually remove the suburban houses and the suburban gas stations and reforest it and re-establish natural territory. And the other side, you would create a pedestrian urban environment. And you can see the sort of superimposition on an aerial view over Cleveland. And just a close-up, working out the details. At the apex of that X, in one case, we made a kind of hybrid dam, where in the dam there was a lot of different kinds of functions, but it also created a recreational lake to the left, and you can see the clarified rural area at the base. The most difficult city that we worked on was Phoenix. Phoenix is sprawling in every direction, and there's a wonderful series of desert tracts left that are unspoiled, and we decided to make C-shaped brackets around 2 of them and make what we call spatial retaining bars, which preserve that aspect of the desert, and the city would just sprawl right up to that threshold and stop. It's important to remember that Phoenix, the name of Phoenix, comes from the Hohokam Indians who inhabited that territory for 1,000 years in complete harmony with the desert and created a network of canals, always 7 feet deep and 30 feet wide, a mysterious mathematical consistency. So this idea of 30 feet wide shows up in our architecture in these spatial retaining bars. Basically, they're concrete frame exposed, almost like adobe courtyards down below that you enter, moving up into the section. But the undersides of these 30 by 30 structures are highly polished concrete, so that at sunrise and sunset at the edge of the city, you'd have a sort of floating apparition recalling these canals of the Hohokam Indians. We worked out all the plans and sections, and for a new kind of living, we envision loft-type units where people have fax machines, computer connections. They really don't commute to work. They live in these lofts. They can come and go at their leisure. And you can see here the first 4 after they were built and the sun rising over Phoenix. So as a kind of conclusion, what I'm trying to work on, and I realize it's rather raw, is the notion of a series of conditions which establish a kind of pre-theoretical ground, the matter of tactility, the idea that program can become a limited concept, the idea of space, parallax, and perspective, and again that word parallax for me probably encapsulates the whole point of the lecture, and the last most difficult section of Project and Society. Thank you.
Jeff, can you turn up the lights and we can take, I don't know, 15 minutes of questions? Can somebody hit the light switch back there? Good job. Okay. You can, whoever raises their hand.
Questions, comments, arguments? Somebody. No questions. I don't believe there are no questions. If there are no questions, it's hot in here. We'll just break.
If you're a student, you get extra credit for questions. It's a good question. You're not here.
Did you do your own watercolor painting?
No credit for that one.
Yeah. They're not very big. They're only about this big. They get projected. Yes.
All right.
Difficult questions.
I was just wondering if you could show that slide as well. I was wondering why the filmmakers had influenced your direction.
You know, that house in Dallas was influenced a bit by Tarkovsky. Do you know his work?
Yeah.
He always used flooded rooms, and it was interesting in the first presentation of that house that the client knew his work, so that the idea of the flooded room somehow was lubricated by her knowledge of Tarkovsky's work. So that I think I'm very impressed by some of his things, and Antonioni and Brunuel.
Perhaps you could elucidate a little bit why you use the term pre-theoretical, and perhaps relate the subject matter of this lecture to some working.
In a way, it's my. I'm not pretending to be the author of any of this. Anybody who has read Merleau-Ponty or interpretations of phenomenological positions after Husserl realized that. But I think what's interesting to me is I find it very difficult to have a theory of architecture in these times. And I find, I guess I'm very skeptical about theories of architecture, but I find when I'm reading phenomenology that I'm reading about something which is before theory, and that was the attempt, that was the desire. You know, it's funny because the discipline had its heyday maybe in the 50s, from 1947 when Merleau-Ponty's major tome came out until about 57, and somehow it died out, it died away, and other things came up. But I think right now, especially now, for me, there's a strange tension in architectural theoretical circles, and I would say half seem to base their position on the word. And I would have to place all of Derrida's work somehow more or less in that category as Baudrillard, as a number of those figures. And then the others, and many of them, I think Merleau-Ponty or anyone in that camp, don't place their faith in the word. And I think for architects, perhaps we have to look at the material, the space, something before the word. And I don't know, I use this term pretheoretical because somehow I can't write about what I'm saying. It's actually easier to show this. I try to write this lecture, but it's easier to show it. So it's a struggle, but it's just trying to get at something. It's trying to start an argument with a certain camp, perhaps. Well, actually, we did a project once where we used chance. We've set up a framework and said inside of that framework, everything will be totally given out to a kind of random condition. I wouldn't say we use it very often. I think I wouldn't discount it as a possible operation. I certainly respect John Cage's work. I think he's one of the most inspiring figures. In fact, he lives on the top of the building next door to us, so we see him every once in a while in the street. But
are you happy with the way your work has turned out so far? Do you find it very frustrating or very satisfying?
I'm frustrated that most of it hasn't been built, if that's what you mean.
But that has been.
Well, I've always, the things that have been built, I've been very excited about, and I've never been disappointed because I've either, the client has either fired me or else we've carried out a really nice project. But one of the disappointing things is that some of it has been torn down. And like shops on Madison Avenue, because Madison Avenue rent is so high. It's like, for a tiny shop, $18,000 a month. So you find yourself a victim of other forces in society, in a sense. And you feel strange about that. That's sad. That definitely is sad. But somehow we spend so much time in the conception and in working through that there really is, I mean, a real joy when something gets built. Right now we have 2 things under construction, which is, I think it's the first time in 12 years, so that's nice.
Are you optimistic about what's going on?
I'm just generally optimistic because I believe in architecture as a kind of force. I'm not sure where one's going to build it today. Maybe in Japan, maybe in Europe. I don't know. I mean, it's a mystery. Where the next project comes from is a total mystery. For 13 months, we didn't have a single project, and all of a sudden, in 2 days, we had 2 little things. They're small, but I mean, how does one know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic? It's a strange world.
How much force do you see architecture having on our society in order to shape or change?
I think it has the power to change the way we live, and I think it does. That's an argument that's been going on for centuries, but my experience just in having these clients, and when we build certain things like that strange space I showed you, the dissolving space, those are very interesting conditions because I thought I would never take that project. They're very unsophisticated people, but in a way we changed the way they lived in that space. They have a house in Nantucket that's full of 1 million tchotchkes and rocking chairs and antiques, and they just kept it all in Nantucket, and they keep this space as a kind of Manhattan existence, and they're very proud of it, and in a way I think it changes the way they live in the city. So even at the scale of a tiny domestic interior, I think there is an effect that takes place.
I was thinking more on the last issue that you raised.
Project in society.
Yeah.
That's a larger question, but certainly, I mean, we're all involved in it, and I don't know. I'm always amazed at how powerful a group can be, for instance, and stopping something from. It's actually easier to stop things from being built than it is to build things. That's the problem. I would like to see ways to build things with that same kind of force. The only reason being is when I'm just speaking, maybe I need another word, and it might even be the wrong word, but some way of projecting the idea of space from the idea of the standpoint of the human eye and the actual experience, rather than relying on an abstract condition that you find in an architect's axonometric projection, which I still use as a conceptual tool, but to try to understand, let's say, a condition of experience, which is something that's an unfolding. You know, when you actually, we've found ways of designing in perspective to be really powerful that way. That if you take a position in a perspective and you move 5 feet over, the whole way walls relate and the way spaces overlap completely changes. So that kind of idea as a sort of working method also.
Do you use it for all your projects, designing a project, and then going to the lab?
No. Every project is different. I mean, sometimes you're faced with just something quite different, and I think you have to have another approach. We don't have a methodology in that way. I think it definitely will influence the architecture of the city. It is influencing the architecture of the city. I'm not afraid of it, but I really think that in the end, the actual experience of architecture is something that is a kind of resistance to film and to electronic media. It stands as a kind of resistance in its physicality. You know? Well, I wouldn't want to be a prophet about that, but I would bet that the phenomena of space and light and material will continue no matter how many megabytes computers can achieve.
In the lecture series schedule, it says that you are hailed as the most influential architect of your generation. Now
It's all hype, you know. It's really hard to deal with it too, because you realize, you know, when you're sitting behind the sort of door on 2 filing cabinets in a little chair and barely able to pay the rent, and you know, you've built a couple of little things and there's some hype, and then you realize also that if there's a magazine article that's hypey, that you're going to suffer from that. You actually suffer from that. You would like to just do your work. Magazines actually are kind of consumption agencies. They want to consume something and then spit it out. So there's a kind of danger in our society that cycle goes on. So. No, I don't know. I mean, what you're talking about is hype, and I'm against it, but I don't know how to deal with it. You know, I mean, you find your things. I mean, you find things published you never gave permission for. You see it, you can't believe that it's, you know, that someone would do that, and you just watch in a certain sense.
Where do you get the most satisfaction out of art?
When it's under construction, and you can smell the concrete and smell the sawdust, and you know, and also that the workers start to understand it. Right at that, you know, there's that area right in the beginning of a project where everybody's your enemy because they don't know what you're doing and they think you're crazy. And then somewhere when the space starts to form, they start to become really excited about it. And when they get excited about it, they actually work harder. I mean, there's a kind of moment in a project which is a really strange moment that there's also a scary moment when the client sees it and they don't think they like it. That comes right before the good moment. Okay, we should go.
We're going to see you in New York.
Yeah.